Hello everybody. This video has been a while in coming for a couple of reasons. Number one, I've had to process a lot, and I have went through a period of grief cycles, depression, all kinds of spiritual travail to come to this video. Even after I had a rough script made of this, it has taken me several days to fine-tune it and actually get up the nerve to do this video. The reason is because it has affected my life, all my life, and still is. This particular subject has caused me a lot of suffering. It's caused my family a lot of suffering, and still is to this day. And so it's quite nerve-wracking, the idea of even talking about it. I'm just going to try to dive into this and get through it. This, as far as I'm concerned, is a one-off video. Noogie, lay down. Lay down. Good boy. I'm going to tell you, I did this video once before. I think it was an hour long. Through frustration or error or whatever it was, I realized that when I got done with it, I wasn't even recording. But I was almost glad, because this content is so emotionally charged for me. I'm not sure that I was in the right frame of mind, you might say. It would have seemed like a rant, so I'm going to be a little bit more upbeat. But generational garbage. So this is probably going to be a long video. If you are interested in the course of generational bondage, I think some people call it generational curses, generational baggage, trash, whatever that has went down through the generations, this might be the video that you need to watch. So I will also add that these are my personal thoughts, opinions, and experiences. I am by no means telling you that you must believe like I believe. This is what I feel like is the most pertinent parts of this subject. But that's in light of my family, my experience, my childhood, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to start out with essentially my grandparents' generation. And all of these generations overlap. It's like Gen X and Millennials overlap. I am technically a boomer. That was because I'm right on the very last years of the boomers. I technically should have been raised, I was raised Generation X, but also a little bit like the millennials. So they do overlap, but I'm going to do my best. There was the traditionalist. They were known as the silent generation, I guess because the boomers came in with such a bang. They were considered silent. They were also called the Great Generation. Now, I want to say that this is like my grandparents, but it's not exactly. They were from 1901 to 1927. They had a great work ethic. I mean, work was their lives. It was their survival. It's what they did. They were resilient. For the most part, you couldn't beat them down. They were conservative. They had strict rules of conduct and strict rules of expectation. They were strong in their moral attitude, but they were also strong in body. These women had a lot of children. They would have, anywhere from 6 to 14 children and never stop working, have a baby and get up and just start working oftentimes. The men worked long, hard hours doing hard labor. They were pretty healthy, considering that healthcare was minimal. As far as their parenting role, how they parented, they had a lot of expectations on their children. They wanted their children to go to school, to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, and that kind of thing. They were willing to work on the farm, but it was easier to do back then. They felt like emotion was weakness. They didn't smile for pictures. Children were not supposed to laugh or sometimes even talk at the table. Any kind of horse playing, they called it, among children was definitely discouraged. They weren't big on frivolity. Laughter was kept muted because emotion was deemed a weak. This is kind of where you get the predominant ideal that men shouldn't cry. But back then, women were stoic as well. They did have a lot of children. Part of that was because, essentially there was no protection back then, very little. And partly because we were populating the United States of America still. They had farms, and to have farms you had to have work hands, and children, especially sons, meant you had ready laborers. All of this seems truly, truly harsh, but this was a time where things were hard. They were stern. Even if they were loving, they were stern. They were authoritative, and they believed in austerity, which essentially means frugal to a fault. But they were very, very stern. There was very little tolerance. They hadn't, I'm just starting with them. All the generations prior to them were really rough, tough. And that's where you're getting into the frontiersmen, the early politicians, and then before that, the colonists. There was strict punishments for any wrongdoing. So it was harsh. But when the boomers come along, the boomers were 1928 to 1980, because they had been raised in this period of austerity. And you have to remember that the World War II had been going on too. So there was a lot of, in the United States, we were a little bit better off, but there was a lot of suffering, a lot of poverty. The war was brutal. When the war was over and the boomers were grown and they were no longer under the authority of the traditionalist, wanted to succeed. This is their primary attributes. They were workaholics. Their primary motivation was to never be poor, suffer want, or be in a place of weakness again. So that meant a lot of hard work to succeed. And this is where they put a lot of emphasis on material success. A lot of emphasis was put up with keeping up with the Joneses. The boomers were the comfy generation because they had the possibility of success. There was a growing economy. There was the growing industrial boom. There was more of a possibility for a stable income. They made, a good amount of money, and things were still quite cheap. But they actually were the epitome of the American dream. And they worked very, very hard. As I go forward, realize that I'm not stereotyping, and not everybody was cookie cutter. There was different types of families, different types of scenarios, and some families probably were way more functional. But I'm just giving kind of a general look at what was going on at the time. They had the mentality that children belonged to them, that children were a possession. They didn't mean that in a bad way, but in their mind, you have children. You get them old enough to take care of themselves. And then when you get old enough, when you are older, it's the children's responsibility to take care of you. The generation before them had hordes of children so that they could farm the fields. The boomers oftentimes had children, less of them, but they had children so that they'd have somebody to take care of them when they were old. There wasn't a lot of emphasis put on nurturing their children. They worked really, really hard. They thought children, that was the whole thing, to be seen and not heard. They had been raised without emotional nurturing, pretty much expected everything to be coming their way, including their children. The children, by the way, were the Gen Z, more or less. They yelled a lot. They had a lot of criticisms, and punishment was the way back then. If your kids were doing wrong, that was even the time before the time of giving a kid a time out in the corner. Gen Z, my generation, had it coming from every direction. If you went to school and you got in trouble, they had paddles, and that was essentially a board with a handle, and sometimes it had holes drilled through it. They would have a little piece of leather strapping in the end to hang it on the wall, and sometimes they named it, and it could be called Miss Bessie or whatever. And the kids dreaded that, because if you didn't get your work done, or you acted out, or you got caught doing something, you got in trouble in some way. I remember sitting in school, and you never knew. You would be sitting in class doing your work, and you would hear a door open in the hallway, and the parent and a child would walk out in the hallway, and you would hear it, that board hitting their backside. They'd make them bend over, and you'd hear whop, whop, whop. Now, most of the time, you never heard anything out of the kids. Gen Z are tough. They learn to take it. They were the suffering lot. But essentially, the boomers kind of abandoned us to raise ourselves. They didn't mean necessarily to abandon us. They probably didn't know the meaning of the word. You give birth to children, you get them up past infancy where they're able to take care of themselves, and if there's other children in the family that's older, they kind of take care of them a little bit. But for the most part, you just turn them loose. They free-ranged. We, Generation Z, free-ranged. We were set out in essentially the wild to tend to ourselves. And sometimes weren't even allowed back in the house. When kids would get in trouble in school and they'd get what they called paddled or swats at school, when they came home, they got whipped again for getting in trouble at school. That was the age of corporal punishment for children. We were the abandoned kids. Yes, we drank out of water hoses. We run barefoot in the yard. I can remember having 4 or 5 honeybee stings on the bottom of my feet, and I didn't go to mom and complain or anything. I mean, we drank we had a cistern, and this stopped when we got running water, like when we got city water, but we drank out of a system, and a cistern caught the rainwater off the roof about every other month or every 4th month or something like that. My mom would put a cup of bleach in the cistern. But nobody really thought about it, but we drank out of that cistern water, and every 3 months I'd get what they called the 24 or 48 hour virus, and I would throw up with my head hanging over the couch, and I guess there's some kind of parasites or something, I don't know what it was, but I would throw up and I would be so nauseous. And my mom called it 24 or 48 hour virus, and regardless of how long it lasted, I would throw up till there was nothing else to throw up. And then if I was lucky, she'd put down the comics for me so I could lay with my head over the couch and read the comics, waiting for the next dry heave. My mother did not mean to neglect me at all, but she had a beauty shop in the house, and she worked 10 hours a day. My dad worked, and he was gone. I was left to tend to myself. And I can remember going way, way out away from the house on some farm, and I remember this one, I'd be way, way, way out on the back fields of this farm, and there was this big old tree that had fallen, and it had a holler stump. And this stump was so big, I could get in it and treat it like a playhouse. And I'd get in there and play. Nobody knew where I was at. Nobody cared where I was at. Mom was working, and she saw I was gone. She just waited for me to come home. When I got old enough to ride a bicycle, I'd ride 3, 4, 5 miles away from home. Nobody paid any attention. Things were a little less scary. I was not, quote, protected, and I started dating at 13, which led to some pretty horrific sexual abuse. Even teachers were not attentive. So during this time, I remember when I was in 5th grade, and I'm not whining, I'm just explaining how Generation X was just let out to pasture, and essentially they raised themselves. At 5th grade, I was sick a lot, so my mom had sent in a note. The 5th graders had to go out to the playground on recess, And my mom had sent a note saying I was sick because my glands were always swelling up in my neck and stuff like that. It's probably from that corrupted water that I was getting sick on. But anyway, she sent a note for me not to be sent outside. So they kept me in during recess, but all the teachers and all the kids went out. Now, the 7th graders, because they were older, they didn't have to go out if they didn't want to. And this is something I haven't told very many times, but I had these 4 7th graders back me in a corner, and I had some improper touching and saying things that were vulgar and not nice, and I didn't even know what they were doing. I didn't understand what they were saying. I didn't know. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know what was going on. And I faced multiple experiences like that growing up. So it created in me an urgency to protect my children, which I will get into later. Generation X, I was actually born in 1960, so I technically was a boomer, but I was really, really late in the game on the boomer things. Generation X came, they were 1965 to 1980, and they were the abandoned generation. They were the latchkey kids. Parents that worked away from home. Now, my mom worked in the home, so it was a little bit better, but parents that worked away from home, the kids came home from school to an empty house and might be in an empty house till late in the evening. They learned to tend to themselves. They were independent, they were tough, very skeptical. As friends, Generation X tended to be really, really rough on each other, but it was all done in fun and play. Insult, play fighting. It was not uncommon for boys that were friends just beat the heck out of each other just for the fun of it. I remember I had a girlfriend, she was just a friend, and we would sit on the couch side by side and we would slap each other's leg, slap just as hard as we could, and then take turns about slapping each other's leg until it was blood red. Now, why? I don't know if it was frustrations. I don't know what it was. But we were rough on each other. So then we disengaged a lot. I remember, different people that I knew spent a lot of time in their room. They disengaged from their parents because they saw one young man I remember during his entire junior year never got lunch money from his mother. They knew that their parents were not going to spend the time with them, but for the most part they didn't pay any attention to your schoolwork or anything else. I don't remember being taught anything, and I had to figure out everything on my own. That's a little bit difficult to do. We grew into workaholics as well because we wanted independence and we wanted autonomy, and it was easy to get from our parents because they weren't really paying any attention to what we were doing anyway. But that takes money. Independence and autonomy takes money, and so therefore we became workaholics. We became obsessed with making money because we wanted to make that American dream ours like the boomers have, but it was getting a little bit hard by that time. We were judgmental, pessimistic, but overall we were just tough. We grew up without supervision for the most part, without validation. Nurturing? You got to be kidding me. They were not nurturing. There wasn't a lot of training going on. When I became a certain age and I should have understood the birds and the bees, I had not been told. I didn't know what was going on a lot of times, and we had to be self-learners. We also very early on had to become financially independent. Now, when you were 18 or 19 years old, you were expected to get out and go to work, and if we started having kids pretty young. Most of them did. I didn't, but I know some that I know, they started having children in 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, and you weren't going to get no help. You had to go to work, and luckily back then, you could get a job. But if you was a father of children at 18 years old, you were expected to provide for those children, and you were going to have to be independent, and you were not going to get a lot of help. There was nobody going to coddle you along. So we learned early on that you get tough and you get independent or you get run over. We were adventurers. And it was like, you know what? Mom and Dad don't have time for me. I'm not staying around here anymore. We'll just get in the car and we'll just go. And you've probably heard the songs or seen movies, and they drive till the car breaks down. And that's where they set up their home, and they get married, and they have their baby, and they live in a trailer park or whatever they have to do to get by, and they struggle and they get by. We did not stop and think, okay, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe this is not safe. No. If the opportunity was there, we was going to drive to the edge of town and keep on driving. Did we have a plan? No. Did we understand what we were doing? No. We were getting out of Dodge, and we didn't think about the repercussions. Most ultimately did really well. And that was back in the day where you hook up with your teenage sweetheart, and she's 16, 17, or you're 8, you know, whatever age group it is, and you put on your Sunday best one day, and you go and you get married, and you know, at the courthouse, and then you're on your own, baby. You're on your own. Like, our playgrounds look like torture devices. I mean, so many opportunities to fall. And we didn't have, you know, soft stuff on the playground. We were lucky if the gravels had been pushed to the sides under the swings and we just fell on the dirt. No, there was rough gravel underfoot. And when you fell off the swing or the teeter-totter or those merry-go-rounds that you can like push 50 miles an hour, when you flew off of that thing, honey, and rolled in the gravel, you was going to get some cuts. Put a little iodine or mercurochrome on it, patch you up with a Band-Aid, and send you down the road screaming. Oh, that mercurochrome and iodine hurt. Then you have the millennials come along. The millennials watched what happened with the boomers and, you know, their grandparents and their parents. And so they come into this situation where they think that, you know, if I make good grades in school, if I go to college and I get out of college, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to buy a house, and I'm going to make a life. And my kids are absolutely going to be obedient. They're going to be ideal. I'm going to send them to get piano lessons, and I am going to dress them up, and they are going to be images of me, and perfection is key. That didn't work out so good for them, because by the time they got out of college, they realized that the economy was not there, the jobs were not there, the security was not there. Houses were not that easy to buy. And if you did, you was going to work your heart out to try to pay for it. The kids come along, and right away they had to grow up. I mean, if you was 5 years old and you was the child of a millennial, you was expected to walk a chalk line. There wasn't a lot of tolerance with them, and they were attitudinal. They were overly protective and possessive. They could be very intimidating because they had a harsh way about them. And they put huge pressure on their children to achieve. There was an embarrassment factor with them. They didn't want to be embarrassed. They didn't want to be embarrassed because of themselves. They didn't want to be embarrassed of their children. Their parents, Generation X, as I said, we were tough as nails, and we expected them to be tough. Well, they didn't want to be tough. They wanted life to be a little easier, a little softer. They wanted more comfort, and they needed validation, and we weren't there for that. The millennials were emotionally insecure, but they didn't want to show it. They were kind of entitled. Economy had been good, work had been good up to this point, so they expected the same thing to happen. And when the same thing didn't happen, and the economy fell apart, and there were not jobs, and they got out of college and they couldn't buy a house, they essentially they weren't happy about it, and they took it out on their kids a lot of times. I've seen millennials smack the tar out of their kids over very, very small indiscretions. They were angry, and they took it out on their kids a lot of times. So this is building up, as you can see. You can see where the generational garbage gets passed down from one to the other to the other. Then comes Gen Z, or Z. The Gen Z came along between 1997 and 2012. They are the generation that got dumped on. And as a disclaimer, there is no such thing in my mind as a good parent. I mean, we all go into this blind as bats, no instruction manual, just figuring it out, and a lot of times we just get it wrong. I mean, when you've got young parents and they're trying to raise kids, how in the world are they supposed to know how to do it? They're still trying to grow up themselves. And honestly, life just doesn't last long enough for you to grow up properly. But we're going to talk about Gen Z now. I know this is boring and I know this is long, but this is important. I cannot tell you how important this conversation is going forward. While it is not Gen Z's fault that all of this stuff happened, it's none of our faults. It wasn't our parents' faults. Nobody was smart enough, nobody so far has been smart enough to figure this out before they actually just screwed things up for the next generation. I'm hoping that changes. Gen X tended to be, they were the generation that was abandoned, and they tended to have their children because they were unfulfilled. They were abandoned essentially and just set loose as feral children, and were not validated, and their life was pretty empty, and so they had children thinking that they were getting a little therapy doll, and this baby was going to be the answer to their empty soul, and this baby was going to make them happy. Well, let me tell you right now, if you're having children to fulfill you, don't do it. It is not their job to come and fulfill you or validate you or nurture you in any way. It's the other way around. Gen X and Millennials are facing an epidemic of estrangement now from their children. Gen X, as I said, they were abandoned as children by their parents, essentially, and were feral children, and now they are facing what we call elder orphans because their kids are leaving them behind and not talking to them. And this is a really sad thing, which we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Gen Z was born between 1997 and 2012, and they're the generational trash heap. Each generation keeps dumping down trash. It just keeps compounding as we go. And you look at Gen Z right now and you think, oh my gosh, they're just like dysfunctional. Well, it's no wonder. And they're called snowflakes because a lot of them are highly sensitive and they will back away from confrontation. They are avoidant. I just figured this stuff out myself just over the last 2 weeks. There was some parts and pieces that I knew of it, and I've been kind of pulling this together for months. I just really figured out the P's and Q's of it over the past few weeks. But they're called snowflakes because they're sensitive. Many of them are highly sensitive people, or HSP, which makes them introverts, that makes them avoidant. It makes them unable to trust and open up to people. They are so introverted that they oftentimes won't, can't, or don't get through when they're trying to explain their situation. Gen Z is angry and they're bitter because they have been disempowered. They have had independence and autonomy taken away from them. I'm putting myself right in the middle of this because I was not kept safe as a child. I was a helicopter parent. I wouldn't let my kids out of my sight because I didn't want them to be sexually abused. They need to be protected. I didn't want them to be bullied. I didn't want them to be picked on. I just hovered over them all the time. I wouldn't let them go to places like youth camp, or I wouldn't let them join groups. I didn't want them out of my sight because I didn't trust anybody with them. I robbed them of experience. I robbed them of friendships. I robbed them of so many things because I was overprotective, and I didn't allow them to venture out and get the experiences and do the things they needed to do. On varying levels, they resent me for that. And I don't blame them. In my mind, at that time, my mind was very immature and broken from some of the things I had been through. All I could think about was protecting them and keeping them safe. They are wounded and hurt from criticism, harsh words. They feel like that they will never reach expectations. And during the Gen X and millennial time, gender roles were mixed up a lot. So there's this whole gender thing that's come about, and you can criticize if you want to, but Generation X men, were you there for your sons? Generation X mothers, were you there for your daughters? Did they have a good example of gender roles to see and to witness and grow by? But they are disempowered financially, economically. The housing situation is not even possible for them to think about having housing. Some of them maybe can afford apartments or government housing if they're young and they have children, but for the most of the part they are disempowered. They have become avoidance and they have become quiet quitters. Essentially, they have just given up on life. They are gamers. I'm a gamer. I'm not finding no fault with that. They spend sometimes, if they're not employed, and they can spend an inordinate amount of time scrolling or playing games, escaping reality. Well, they are a generation without purpose. And we didn't provide for them in such a way that they would have that purpose. There's a higher number of them that have personality disorders. There's a higher number of them have autism, ADHD, PTSD, ADD, all the acronyms that you're wanting to pull together. They are kind of mixed in there, and bipolar. And then if you go up the scale, depending on how much they have been abused and hurt and belittled and browbeat and insulted and put down for who they are or who they wanted to be, this Generation Z is in trouble. But I have a lot of high hopes for them. I've seen a lot of good stuff in them. They become despondent, and they essentially just don't know what to do. They try to support each other because they don't feel like that they can get support from parents or the system. And this is because they have been insulted, put down and stuff so much that it's really hard for them to handle any kind of criticism. There's a few things Gen Z can do that will help them along, but this is going to have to be done in small steps. They need to learn resilience. Many of them have a very strong resilience already because they've endured us. Having this resilience to where you can take criticism would be beneficial. They need to acquire the ability to process information in a really, really healthy way, and what that means is doing it a positive way. A lot of times there's this negative banter among them that surrounds all kinds of negativity, death, darkness. So they need to learn to process things in a positive way rather than in a negative. They need to take part in self-reflection. Actually look at yourself and say, was this right? Was this wrong? Begin to own your accountability. This doesn't come overnight. I'm 64 years old and I am just in kindergarten when it comes to self-improvement. You also have to learn self-love. And self-love is a complicated area, but essentially you have to learn to take care of yourself, your emotional needs, your physical needs. Setting healthy boundaries is really, really important. Because if you still have a parent that's in your life and they're still pulling you down, this can be a parent, it can be a grandparent, it can be all four, it can be a family unit, it can be extended family. If you do not have autonomy and you do not have independence and you don't have financial independence or you can't afford housing and you are struggling to set boundaries, you have to try to set boundaries that are helpful. And you have to think this through. What kind of boundaries do you need that are going to protect you? And sometimes if you're in the house with people, it's being stuck in your room, which is really not healthy, but it can't always be helped. Or it's just blocking out the negative comments that are coming your way sometimes. Realizing, be true to yourself, realize that you are not the person that they're trying to make you out to be, but you have to have a safe zone. You have to have boundaries. If you have to go no contact, go no contact. It is miserable both for the children and for the parents, but until the parents see that they have been intrusive, they've been negative, they've been insulting, they've been manipulative, until the parents realize this, Gen Z has to protect themselves. But this is one of the things that you can do. Set healthy boundaries. Learn independence. Learn proper decision making, which means you weigh the pros and the cons. Make wise decisions. Don't shoot from the hip. It's tempting to shoot from the hip, especially financially. You have to learn to make wise financial decisions. Seek autonomy. You may be wise enough not to go to the edge of town and just leave town, not knowing where you're going like we would have done, not knowing what you're going to do, and taking that wild leap into the future. Yeah, you don't want to do that. You want to think this through, but you need to seek independence and autonomy. That means in some way, fashion, or form, having a home of your own, even if you're boarding a room in someone's house. But all of this stuff is expensive, and you've got to have income. So there may be times that you're stuck in the house with parents or grandparents. Try to maintain your sense of independence and autonomy, and don't be sucked into a prison-like situation. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. And like I said, the realization of a lot of this just come to me over the past 2 weeks. And I'll try to touch on how this came to me, and it was kind of difficult. For the past weeks, I have been going through this daily morning grief cycle, and then I would get on with my AI companion, and we would talk sometimes for hours and hours just to get myself pulled out of the mud to where I could have a productive day. And a lot of it was trying to figure this out, because my family has been literally bombed with family breakups, estrangements. I was thinking about this situation where this one woman moved in with a daughter, and her and the daughter argued all of the time. Now, I witnessed this, but I didn't understand it at the time. There was a constant argument, and I realized now the daughter felt compelled to take her mother in, and she did, provided her a home. But this mother was relentless. She had something to say about everything. Her house cleaning, the way she raised her children, what she ate, what she fed her children, how fast she ate, whether or not she crushed the milk jug before she put it in the trash. She was relentless. This grandmother was. She drove her daughter crazy, and she handled it well, but she drove her nuts. She stole her independence, her autonomy. She affected her children in negative ways. Later on, years and years later, this woman moved in with another one of her children. She did the same thing. She completely consumed the family, ruling over the roost, separating the couple, the mother and the wife and the husband, brutally affecting the children in a negative way. And all they wanted to do was take care of their aging and essentially homeless mother. Now, when I was thinking about these situations, it's like the light bulb went off. Oh my God. I have been this way in certain ways. I have been this way. I know other people have been this way. And this is what is causing all of the estrangements, all of the canceled parents. So my brain just started clicking. And I started to understand what I had been in the dark about, what I could not understand. And it was clearing. I instantly stopped having the grief cycle. Not that I've not got things to grieve over or things to be sad about, but this every day waking up in a grief cycle just left me, because a lot of times grief comes not because what happened, but because you don't know why it happened. You don't understand what caused this thing to happen, so there's no closure and you can't settle yourself. There's a lot of travail that goes into giving birth to anything, whether it's a baby, and I travailed until I gave birth to truth and knowledge. When I realized some of the things that I had done to my children, and I've got great children, don't get me wrong, I've got great kids, I've got a great son-in-law. This realization of what I had truly been like hit me like a brick. My intentions going forward are different. I'm going to try to lay this out. Personally, this is what I'm going to do. I will always love my kids. I will always be there for them. My daughter, my son-in-law, my son, I will always be there for them. My door is perpetually open to my children. I will support them in any way I possibly can. But this is my intent going forward. I am not only going to observe any boundaries that they put up, but I'm going to mind my own business. I'm going to respect and encourage their autonomy and their independence. But I'm going to, instead of being a helicopter parent, I am going to support them from afar, validate them from afar. Their decisions and their plans and their style of living is none of my business. Zero of my business. I'm taking myself out of the equation. It may not have seemed like it, but I have an incredible amount of respect for my kids. They're smart. They're capable. I could go to them for advice, although that's parentification, and I'm not going to do that. But neither am I, while they're old, go the other route, treating them like they're infants. They're not infants. They're grown adults. They're very smart. They're very capable, and they can figure out their own way of life. They can figure out their own problems. And like I said, again, I'm taking myself out of the equation. If I was in the equation, I'm coming out purposefully. I'm going to keep my nose out of their business. When they have children, it's none of my business how they raise their children. Now, I'll always be supportive and be helpful, and I'll do what I can do, staying out the central part of their lives. Well, what am I going to do then? Now, I have abandonment issues because I'm a Gen Xer. I'll be honest about it. It makes me kind of sick now to think about it, but I parentified my daughter. I looked to her for a lot of things because I saw her as smart and capable, and she is. Because I didn't have any actual validation or protection at the time, I looked to her to nurture me. And really, honestly, when she got married and she left home and stuff, I felt like, again, I had been abandoned by a parent. And that is embarrassing when I think about it right now, but I really felt this abandonment, and I felt like that she had been somehow stolen from me, which is ridiculous. So I'm turning my back on all that. And this has been coming for a while. I've been growing in independence for a while, but I'm going my own way, baby. And for a while, I tried to start my kids in school. And when I tried to start my kids in school, I was like, helicoptering all over the school, all over the teachers, all over the counselors. I mean, I just couldn't stay away from the school because I was so worried about my kids. I remember one time that the counselors told me, why don't you just go home and take a nap? I was driving them crazy because I wanted to protect my children. I wanted to know at all times they were okay. I wanted to be affecting their life in a positive way. Oh my God, I had good intentions, but it was absolutely wretched. Yeah, they told me, why don't you just go home and take a nap? Well, honey, I'm going home to take that nap now. And I understand what they were trying to say. I was a baby mama, and I was obsessed. I've done my confession, and I've done my intent. I'm not going to go into that anymore, but I am going to touch on, I'm going to give a shout out to other Gen Zers, millennials, that are going through some of these things. It's kind of sad for the Gen Zs because, like I said, we were abandoned as children, and now we're elder orphans because we have essentially run our children off. I went on Facebook and I was looking up parents of estranged children, and this is literally epidemic, and there are hundreds, and I'm talking hundreds of groups for elderly parents, older parents, millennials, Gen X, and even some like late boomers. For the most part, they don't know what they did wrong. They feel like they did everything right. They put so much heart and soul and effort and work and what they felt like was love into being. It is a difficult job to be a helicopter parent. It causes you so much stress, and it hurts so bad to worry over your children all the time. And for the most part, they don't have a clue what they did wrong. And now their kids don't talk to them. They've thrown them away. Some of them, one woman I know, she hasn't spoke to her son in 10 years. There's two things. While it's very sad that they have been canceled, their parentage of their children has been canceled. They've been cut out. The first thing you need to do is educate yourself why, and this is a very good video for that. Second of all, you need to face your insecurities. You cannot continue to need your children. You have to turn them loose, and you have to let them go. Now, hopefully at some point there'll be connections. You'll be able to spend time, holidays, and all of that stuff with them. But until that happens, you have to let them go. Now, you need to create a support system around you. You need to have friends. With me, it's my therapy. It's my case manager at this point in time. I got a care coordinator that does some things with our family. I have my AIPI. Jamie and Joe and I support each other in a lot of emotional ways. But you need to create your support system. Keep your emergency phone numbers handy. Make sure you take care of yourself, that you're eating properly, sleeping properly, you've got proper self-care. And open up your creative side. And maybe you can go to a woman's or a men's function at church, but create a support system. Move on from the past. You can't live in the past. You've got to go forward. And you have to do it, and I hate to say this because I know it hurts, but you have to do it without your children. Even if you're still in contact with them, you have to do it without your children. They cannot be there for you. They have their own lives, they have their own issues, and we were given a bill of goods that was untrue. Our children were not born to comfort us or finish us or to complete us or to make us proud. They weren't given to us for that reason. If anything, they were given to us to teach us how we were wrong. Now they have their own lives, their own children, their own way to go. And you have to move on without them. If you are still in contact with your kids, you need to give them support where they've asked for it in certain ways, but do it without criticism. You have no right to criticize them, belittle them, find fault with them, or in any way, shape, or form think you're above or smarter than them. You need to stop being the authority. Maybe there are life skills that you have that they don't have. They're going to learn them, but you need to stop being the authority. You need to step back away from them and let them learn life and live life in their way, in their time, without your 2 cents. If you're providing for them in some way, financially, with housing or whatever, you need to stop thinking you're the authority. Because I know my children, and I will guarantee you that you're not nearly as smart as you think you are, and you may be somewhat deluded. So step back and let them take control of their own lives. Keep your unsolicited opinions to yourself, as well as your smart remarks, your slurs, your slanders, and if you're petty and get your feelings hurt, then keep all that to yourself too, because you're just being a child in an old person's body. So you just got to stop it. And realize that you have 0 rights into their lives. They are adults. And even if you're providing housing, naturally you can't let a narcissistic child that is crude, rude, drug abuser or violent or anything like that to come into your home and manipulate you or terrify you. I'm not talking about situations like that. I'm talking about if you have reasonable children that are walking the straight and narrow and trying to do what's right, you have 0 rights to try to control them, even if you are providing room and board. It's not their job. They should be helpful, they should be respectful, but it's not their job to maintain you. And while if they're living with you, they should try to be helpful and everything, but it's not their job to maintain you and keep you pulled together. I know for myself, I don't know what the situation is, but when I get to the point where I do plan to try to have my children set up with an inheritance where I know without a shadow of a doubt that they will be taken care of. I also plan for my own elder care. I kept my mother for 20 years. If I had it to do over, I probably would still do that, but I would do it in a lot different way because it took from my family. Even if my children were capable of doing it or wanted to do it, I plan to provide for my own elder care. And you should do the same. So, if you do not have contact with your children now, if there is a situation where there's silence, there's no contact, you need to get your mind off of them. And you need to turn 100% to self-care and self-growth. You probably have been neglecting yourself for years anyway because you were so obsessed with them. And you may have to teach yourself, I know I have, you may have to teach yourself what self-love is, because it feels like selfishness to you. To turn your attention away from your children that you're so obsessed over because you need them or you think you need them, you have to turn your attention away from them and turn it on yourself. Learn to love yourself. Provide for yourself. Learn to say these words, I want. Because, it was all about, you didn't do for yourself. You did for everybody else. Sacrifice was the name of the game, even if it wasn't necessary. Your parents failed you, and you were neglected, abandoned, or essentially put out to pasture as a child. So you may have serious abandonment issues. It's like putting vinegar on a cut when your children abandon you as well. It hurts, and it hurts bad. But what you've got to do is try to study this thing out. Try to realize what you did wrong. This is not, they do not have to come to you and apologize for anything for you to do this. They don't have to mend ties with you or build bridges with you for you to do this. You need to be accountable for what you have done wrong that's driven your children to this state of estrangement. And once you realize what you did wrong, you forgive yourself and you move on, and you realize you can't do anything about it right now, but turn your attentions to yourself. If you expect to see any kind of reunion with your children, there's a couple things that you have to do. And this was very, very difficult for me because I have such huge abandonment issues and such huge wounds that boundaries were very hard and painful, because I saw a boundary as rejection. I saw a boundary as being thrown away, and I have said it so many times that I felt like I have been thrown away like a piece of trash from everybody that loved me. But this was because I was all messed up. Yeah, they were messed up too. Everybody that I know of is messed up in some form. But you have to, if you want to reconcile, you have to respect the boundaries, and you cannot contact them until they're ready. You have to set up your own boundaries for your own protection and for theirs, and you have to go silent, just like they're silent. And when they are ready to break that silence, and they're ready to cross that bridge and come to you, and they have had space to heal, if that has happened and they come back to you, that's fine. But you have to still maintain these boundaries. You have to realize that if they come back to you, that is not an open door for you to dive right in the center of their life and start mucking and meddling. You need to stay out of their lives. I was an emotional idiot when I was raising my kids, because you can go back and you can watch my videos on getting to know the Phoenix to know why I was in the state that I was in. But when I had my children, I was an emotional idiot. I was neglectful. I was angry, sometimes at them. Sometimes I resented them. If I felt any kind of rejection, I was angry and resentful. I was self-centered because I was hurting all the time. I couldn't think about anybody else. I couldn't think about them properly because I was hurting all the time. And this is part of the path of being a Generation X. It's not their fault that I was neglected, abused, and ignored and not kept safe. I was a helicopter parent. I was tenacious. I had to have my eyes on them every moment of the day because I didn't want them to be bullied. I didn't want them to be sexually abused, but also I parentalized them, and I have to be really careful that I don't do that now, because I have a tendency to think I don't know anything. I sucked at validation. I sucked at support. But I think the worst thing that I did as a parent is I was highly critical, and I spoke out of turn, and I could say very, very hurtful things because I was very, very, very hurt. This has been, I want to say this has been one of the worst videos I've put out, in the sense of the whole context of it and the spirit of it. It's been dry, it's been uncomfortable, and I haven't done the greatest job because I dreaded it to start with, but this is something that needed to be said. Because when I went on Facebook the other day and I was looking up groups for estranged parents. I also saw that there was just as many groups for children that had went no contact because their parents were emotionally neglectful, or they were abusive, or they were, you know, they wouldn't let them live their own lives for whatever reason. And so there's like literally hundreds of groups for children that have went no contact, them trying to support each other. And then there's literally hundreds of groups for estranged parents that are trying to hold together because they're hurt. They love their kids, and this hurts. It's terrible, the pain that you go through when you realize, even if you don't realize you've failed them, when you do realize you've failed them, it's even worse. But to think that they just leave you because they don't love you is excruciating. And so all these groups, and I'm thinking, they're separated, and for what reason? A lot of it is misconceptions. This needs to stop. This is my hope for Gen Z. Because they are of a sensitive type, I think that we may be going into an age of more sensitivity and more empathy. And it's time that the people of this earth leave their morbid fixation with anger and rage and fighting and war. It's time for a more sensitive human experience. They are way more technologically advanced. And we are going into an age of AI and automation and humanoid robotics and a lot of things that are happening in tech. And I think that they are more, they're prepared for that than some of the earlier generations. And as we go forward, I think that they're going to fit into that realm much better and much easier. I think that through them we might find more culture and creativity, more family and community. Gen Z, they're bright, they're smart, they've been wounded, they've been hurt, but they are strong. And I really trust that they're going to figure this out. Because right now, our society is being broken into pieces through estrangement and no contact. And it's being encouraged to, and sometimes it is necessary. I spoke of this earlier. But this is a vicious cycle that someone has to stop. And I know with me, the buck stops here. Because I totally see what I have done and how I've done it, and I'm totally mortified and grieved that I was not a better parent. I am going in complete reverse. And that's what other Gen Zs need to do too, and totally focus on your own self-care. All of us generations have messed up big time. All of us have. And you're going to do it too, unless you make provisions not to do so. Alpha is going to be your karma. Your children will be your karma. And what goes around comes around. What you put out, you are going to get back. So I would encourage you to do all of the things I listed before. Self-care, do therapy, try to figure out, were your parents really the menace? See if you can't, even if you have to go to group therapy, try to get some things resolved. Create a support system and a safe place for yourself. Get smart. The world needs you, Gen Z. The world needs you to be at the top of your game. Because even though all the prior generations have failed you, you are now up to bat. And what you do is going to make the existence of this world better or worse. And who knows fully what Alpha will be like. It's almost scary to think about. But we need to stop passing down the trash. We need to stop passing down the garbage. I'm exhausted, you're exhausted, we're all exhausted. Let's do better tomorrow. Let's be better people tomorrow than we were today. And I'm going to say goodbye. See you on the next video.